when you talk about parenting and you talk about these systems, men are not always the folks that are leading in those conversations. But what you also know is that there aren't a lot of Black and brown men who are actually leading in some of these conversations around juvenile justice, foster care, as it relates to their lived experience. And so, to have the opportunity to say, hey, this is what we're doing at the Delta Project, to have an opportunity to talk about this is what you can do to serve and support families, has been really amazing to be able to do that. And not only we're doing it in Michigan, but we're now being able to travel across the country to do it. Welcome to What I Know Now, a podcast that uncovers the stories, experiences, and insights of individuals who have been impacted by the justice system. I'm Cole Williams.
And I'm Joel Van Kuiken. Our mission is to drive positive social change in the lives of system-impacted youth, their families, and our communities.
We sit down with incredible guests who generously share their lived experiences and the lessons they've learned along the way.
It's been a busy couple months.
It has.
And I think part of this podcast is about catching up on some of the things we've been up to, and in some cases, what Cole has been up to.
Yeah.
Because, I mean, you're the executive director of the Delta Project, but that's a title.
That is a title.
There's so much more that you do nationwide. So I think we've had some real wins over the last couple months, but let's just dig into some of the work you've been doing really different parts of the country over the last few weeks now.
Yeah. Well, I've had the pleasure. The Delta Project was invited to the Juvenile Justice Association of Michigan to really talk about family engagement. And so I didn't realize it until I was putting together my presentation that I've been working with families involved in the juvenile justice system for well over 10 years. And knowing that I started out as a parent that was in the juvenile justice system and trying to figure out how to navigate its spaces and interact with this system, I didn't think it was 10 years. So looking back, I'm like, wow, I've been working with parents in this space for well over 10 years and really trying to understand the mechanisms of how this system works. So I was invited to the Juvenile Justice Association of Michigan to put on, I feel like, a 6 to 8 hour training. So it was an all-day training with probation officers across the state of Michigan. And the conversation was really about how do we engage parents? How do we partner? How do we collaborate with them? How do we build a partnership that aligns with supporting kids? And I can tell you, it was a really difficult but rewarding opportunity because part of the challenge was really talking about some of the barriers or the biases that are associated with parents that are involved in our juvenile justice system and how those biases sometimes get in the way of us being able to connect. And so I think that was one of the big pieces that I had to help dispel is like, when we think about parents, and so one of the questions I had for them, when you think about parents, what comes to mind of parents that are involved in our juvenile justice system, and also what comes to mind when we think about them. So what have we heard and what do we think? And a lot of the feedback was just really around a host of biases that aren't always positive.
Well, I just think, a bias, biases are something that we don't realize we have.
Yeah.
It's kind of, we talk about bias all the time.
Right.
We talk about these kind of shortcuts that we like to use to better understand a situation. Those are traps for people, and they're easy to fall into.
Yeah.
And sometimes it feels comfortable to fall into a bias. But I guess, the fact that you've been at this for 10 years and the fact that you're coming at this kind of from both sides now. At this event, and it was on Mackinac Island, is that correct?
That's correct. Yeah, Mackinac Island.
At this event, did you feel like these probation officers could only see one side, or did they have lived experience too? Or were they able to kind of empathize with what some of their, clientele, the people that we serve, are going through as well?
Yeah, not only that, but what registered to me is that there's also a bias about probation officers, right?
Of course.
And there's this bias that, probation officers in some spaces are a part of this engine system that is out to destroy the lives of families and children. But that is not the case, right? And so I think part of one of the conversations is how do we have a conversation about what our roles are, right? And how do we make sure that when we're talking about parents and we're talking about the roles and responsibilities of a PO, or a court appointed person who is serving family court, that we're all having some conversation and dialogue. I think one of the biggest issues I keep seeing is that there's all these biases that get in the way of really us figuring out how do we become partners. And I think partnership as it relates to parents and families and systems, it's rare, and it's possible and it's happening, but I think it's also a very difficult process to have. And so I think one of the things that was really important for me in this workshop was to help POs sort of understand why some parents might show up in the way that they show up as it relates to their behavior. And so some of the things that we often talk about when we think about parents who have children on probation is they're non-compliant, that these parents are part of the problem, that they are lazy, that they don't necessarily understand why this is important, that they are the cause and effect of all the problems. But when you pull back the layers, we often find out from the parents that I serve is that a lot of this is shame, a lot of this is hurt, a lot of this is fear, a lot of this is a lack of a understanding and awareness of the role of the court and the responsibilities and the relationship that they can have and develop with their probation officer. So it's all of these barriers that get in the way of just like organically having a relationship. And it's really hard to have a relationship with someone who's court involved when you think about a system. But I think for kids, we have to be talking about partnerships. Parents and probation officers and judges and all of the people that play a huge role in serving kids have to be thinking about how do we collaborate with each other in a real way that meets the needs of the kids that we're trying to serve. And I think that has been, the conversation that I'm constantly having. How can we do this? Here's how.
Well, I like this idea of here's how.
Yeah.
Because I think one thing that we've understood over the last few years at the Delta Project is that oftentimes our way in is through a probation officer.
Yes.
And I think we are more effective when we work with probation officers and we understand what their needs are and what their constraints are and what they're looking to accomplish in good faith.
Yes.
And the work that they're doing to try and better our society.
Yeah.
I think it's interesting that, we're talking about how, probation officers may have a bias, but the fact that, we have a bias about probation officers.
Absolutely.
And it really goes both ways.
Yeah. Not only that, but we don't understand the role of the probation officer, right? Because the role of the probation officer is, they are case planning. They are, meeting with families after hours. They're trying to connect. And really, the whole concept for the PO is really to find opportunities and ways for this child who is, have broken the law to be able to find a way to receive services so that they don't continue to break laws or so they don't cause harm in the community, right? And so the probation officer's role is really vital in whether or not a child, goes back to committing crimes, but also tied to that is the role that parents play. And so both of them have a huge role to play. So I think it's really important that we begin to unpack the role that a probation officer has when relating to children, but the role that the probation officer has in relating to parents, but also the role that the parent has in also making that connection and partnership with their child as well as the PO. And so I think it's a team that really is about making sure that kids come off probation or don't even become a part of the juvenile justice system. So I think there's a lot of work that we still need to be doing, but there's a lot of work that is being done. And I think part of the work that we're hoping to do with Delta Project is to continue to uplift the voices of folks that are, involved in our systems across the, our city.
So talk a bit about some of the parenting courses that you do, because I think you have a unique lens into this situation, this issue, this, I don't want to call it a problem. I want to call it a reality about our society.
Yeah.
So when you see parents and they are maybe frustrated with their interaction with a probation officer or the courts or the system, as we often call it, how do you counsel them? How do you
Yeah.
guide them through it and help them kind of maybe see some hope
Yeah.
that there is a way through this?
Yeah. Well, I think one of the things I had to learn how to do is not talk.
That's big.
One of
That's
the
very
first
big.
things you have to do with someone who is desperate, who is frustrated, who feels like they don't have a voice, that they haven't been heard, is make sure that you're not talking. So this idea of creating a space where the only person that's speaking is the person that is coming to the table for the service, right? And here's what I'll tell you: many of the parents that come to see me for my parenting groups, they've been either told by a probation officer, recommended, or they've had a judge say, "Hey, I'm going to recommend you or have you attend this parenting class." And I think the one thing that most parents across the board, 90% of the parents that I've served in the last 10 years, hate the word parenting class. Like that, just that word itself or phrase itself creates barriers for parents. And so I've had to learn to say, well, no, it's not a parenting class. This is a group for support. And I think what also has helped me in being able to navigate some of those challenges that I see parents going through is that I get to share my lived experience too. And so I am really pushing across the state that we really, really elevate the voices of lived experience people. Because I think when I share my story, instantly I see the walls come crumbling down for parents. Instantly they feel like, oh, okay, I'm not alone. And I think that has been the key element of all of my work, is that a lot of parents just simply feel alone. They've had a child that has, kind of been dysregulated. They have a child that's struggling with their mental health. They have a child struggling with behavior. They haven't been trained on trauma, so they don't know that this could be trauma related. So they've got all this stuff, and then all of a sudden they find themselves in a position where their child has committed an offense, and now they're in this space called the juvenile justice system, excuse me. And now they're like, okay, now we're going to get services. But they talk about this whole idea of like, I've been trying to get services for my kiddo way before he committed a crime. And so by the time they see me, they are frustrated, they are angry, and not all, right? I have a high number of parents that operate out of that. And then there's a whole different dynamic of parents that are like, whew, finally, I just get some help. I just want to be heard. And so they come into my groups and they literally have an opportunity to listen to other parents that have that lived experience. And I'll tell you hands down, if I had, I don't know, 90% of the parents come into this podcast and talk, one of the things that they will say is they felt like they belonged. And I think that's really key to a lot of this, is that our kids are dysregulated because they're trying to find out how to belong. Our parents are dysregulated because they're also feeling isolated because their children's behavior, which puts them in a position where they start to lose community. They start to lose friends and family because their children's sometimes behavior puts them in a position where they start to lose those very connections that they need to be able to sustain themselves. And so coming to this group, they get to see parents that they don't have to tell the story over and over again. These parents get it. And I think that makes a huge difference in why this work is so important, because belonging and hope is key to this.
Yeah, I think it's really interesting. So, and I know you've talked about this to me in the past, but it sounds like, and I know this, there's real camaraderie.
Yeah.
When people who are on a similar journey can share their successes and challenges together.
Yes.
And I think about these young men and these families, if you really break it down, they're on kind of a journey, a customer journey. If we break it down into an experience.
Yes.
They're experiencing something that we need to map out and think through. We need to look at this from the lens of what are they traveling through? What are they experiencing? What kind of impact is that having on them? And how can we rethink how these systems interact?
Yeah.
That's a big challenge for any community in any society. But I think that might hold some of the keys to finding a way forward that is more equitable and allows people kind of the humanity that they're after.
Yeah. And I think something else is really important. I think when we just get back to recognizing human behavior is connected to understanding the why behind the behavior. I think we're all humans who make choices But when we unpack those choices, there's a why behind it. And I think we do a really great job when we think about the juvenile justice system in unpacking a child's why. We don't necessarily always hold that same question for parents. Why might a parent dysregulate? Why might a parent show up irritable and non-compliant? Why might a parent not want to be involved in anything related to programming? And then we ask that why. Again, it goes back to all the things that we've been seeing, hurt, shame. They're not connected to the relationship of the child. They're disconnected because their children's behavior is so extreme that it causes a disruption in the relationship. And I think when we talk about relationships, I think that's the key of all of this work, is that really this is about establishing and building and having a relationship with someone. And we do a really great job in this country of canceling out people when they abuse the relationship or the relationship has been harmed in some way. And so we don't move into those relationships. We move away from those relationships. And quite often in my work, what I'm seeing is that parents are so hurt by the relationships that they start to unintentionally move away from it. And I think part of what we can do is recognize that our children are hurting, our communities are hurting, and as folks that are in our communities, we have the resources to be able to provide an opportunity for healing. But holding space for healing, Joel, as you know, doesn't feel good. It doesn't look good. It's holding space for healing can be tough and hard. But I think part of being able to tell your story and be heard is one special way to create a level of healing and hope. Not only just for the families and the kiddos, I say kiddos a lot, but for everyone who's working with families. I think we all need a little bit of hope in this time and season of our lives, and in a system that's trying to figure it out and reform it itself too.
For sure. So you also spent some time in Sacramento.
Yes.
And you've been in some other places. You've really been traveling quite a bit over this last month. I mean, tell me a bit about your experience in Sacramento and who you worked with there and what came out of that.
Yeah, so I had a great opportunity to connect with an organization that not only supports kids in the juvenile justice system, River Oaks is the name of the organization, but they also support families in all cross systems. And so I had an opportunity to actually go with my son and take him, who was formerly in foster care and adopted by me. And we had a chance to talk to cross systems of folks, starting from Head Start. So programs that run, Head Start programs right on up into a juvenile justice program. And we were all in one big room, and we got the opportunity to talk about hope. And I just thought it was really amazing to begin to bridge the idea that hope is a really important space to operate out of when we're talking about how to heal relationships with some of our most vulnerable communities. But we got a chance to talk about hope. We got a chance to talk about our story as it relates to me being a foster adoptive father and adopting a son from the system. And he had an opportunity to tell his story to a foster family and a young man who is in a foster home. And so I think for us, again, it's this opportunity for us to elevate and talk about these stories that go untalked about maybe. And then, Joel, I think what also helps us out too is that these are stories that Black and brown men don't often get an opportunity or a platform to talk about. So when you talk about parenting and you talk about these systems, men are not always the folks that are leading in those conversations. But what you also note is that there aren't a lot of Black and brown men who are actually leading in some of these conversations around juvenile justice, foster care, as it relates to their lived experience. And so, to have the opportunity to say, hey, this is what we're doing at the Delta Project, to have an opportunity to talk about this is what you can do to serve and support families has been really amazing to be able to do that. And not only we're doing it in Michigan, but we're now being able to travel across the country to do it.
Yeah, I think what's really cool is that you went with your son, your adopted son. And I almost want to have him at the mic, get him in the chair at some point so we can talk to him as well. Yeah. But can you just kind of share some of his reaction to being out there? I think the biggest reaction was our reaction with each other. He's a young adult. We haven't had a lot of time to spend with each other due to work. And so I think for us to go on a flight together, for us to just sit with each other, for us to
to share the space with other people and to be in a new state, I think was, again, elevated our relationship in a way that, I didn't think about. And I think one of the things that we talk about when we talk about relationships, it's the small things that matter. All of my sons have been speaking since they moved in with me. So I'm like, hey, we're going to talk about what we're living, and we're going to be open, and we're going to be transparent, and you're going to tell them how difficult I might have been as a parent. I want us to be transparent and honest. And so he's been speaking since he was like 13 years. He moved in at he was 13 when he came in. So I think he was about 14 when we started to say, how are we going to talk about what we're living? And one of the things that I wanted to do for all of my sons is that I wanted them to get comfortable speaking in spaces where people didn't look like them. And they would be confident to be able to do that, because if they were confident to speak in the spaces where people don't look like them, they'll be confident to speak anywhere. And so we did a lot of conversations at our table, at our dining room table, with my sons. And so I'm like, hey, we're going to do this in front of people too. And so it was just great to sort of see him in the space and doing what I know he knows how to do. And that's to be honest and share and be transparent about what he's been seeing and experiencing as a young Black male growing up in a foster care system. Yeah.
Let me drill down a little bit on
Please.
that. Let's just talk
Please.
about your sons, because I know you have a biological son.
I do.
And you have adopted son, but you have, how many sons do you have?
Total 8. A total of 8 sons I've had the opportunity to foster. And out of that 8 was one, which is Javare, who I was able to adopt.
Okay.
And what's interesting about that is I tell the story that I was 27 when I had made the decision to even foster. I'm like, some of them are now 27 going on 28. So it's so crazy to see them at 26 and 27. And I was 27 when I committed to this idea that I'm going to show up and make a difference. And I had no idea what I was doing. That's the other part. Like, I didn't know what I was doing. I just had made a commitment to showing up, and I'm just going to figure this out. We're going to try to figure this out together, and I'm probably going to make a whole lot of mistakes, which, oh, Joe, did I. But in the breadth and scope of that was like it was love. Like, I was really trying to say, this is how you belong. This is how you do this. And I was parenting outside. I tell this story of parenting outside of my front yard. I was seeing boys that looked like me outside of my front yard, and I wanted to figure out how to make sure that I could support them in my home and outside. So I became a licensed foster parent at 27. It was crazy.
And you had 8 sons in the household.
Period. Not all at the same time.
Okay.
So it was about 8. I think I fostered for about 8 years, 8 to 9 years.
Got it.
And many of my sons were brothers, so they came in as brothers. And then many of my sons transitioned back to their biological families. But I stayed with them throughout the whole journey. And I think part of the work that I do now is really talking about how do you stay with kiddos when it's tough, when they have caused, their behavior is, it's unbelievable and it's hard. And you've been yelled at, you've been cursed out. You've had all these things happen to you that most parents are like, there's no way I would tolerate that level of disrespect, right? And so I had to figure out, okay, what's the difference between trauma and adolescent behavior? And how do I make sure that I'm showing up and creating a psychological safe place and a physical safe space without also losing myself in that? And so I had to deal with my own ideologies around what was good parenting, old school parenting versus new school parenting. I had to really understand their behavior, and it took a long time to understand how to become a behavior detective, how to ask the why behind the behavior. And I made a lot of mistakes trying to ask the why because I was very reactionary to their behavior. I just responded very quickly, and sometimes my response was yelling. Sometimes my response could be me being aggressive, and not aggressive physically, but aggressively with even my body and my posture and my tone. to get control. And it took me a long time to understand that when I asked the why around behavior, it really allowed me the opportunity to sort of become almost curious about understanding their
Yeah.
behavior, if that makes sense.
Yeah.
Where I spent a lot of time just in full, I need to control this. If I can control this, control them, fix them, they're going to be okay. And my strong-willed son, who I adopted, said something really powerful. He's like, Dad, you don't get to control this. Did you actually think that this was going to be easy? And I was like, yeah, I have a big home, I have a big heart, and I have a little bit of money. Isn't that enough to fix trauma? And soon learned it was so much more. And I had to learn how to be curious, because curiosity opens the door for healing and to ask questions. And so I think once I started to see that it was less about me and more about me less about me controlling situations and more about me finding ways to understand the why, it became less personal. And I think that's where parenting shifted for me.
Yeah. And I think, you're passionate.
Yeah.
But the interesting thing about passion, the more passionate you get, you need to balance that by being dispassionate. You need to be stoic, which you are. Yeah. You need to take a back seat to what you might be feeling inside and let things play out.
Yeah. Yeah.
And then figure out how you can move in that space. And that's a hard skill to attain, because we do want to react.
Yes.
We want to get our head and our hands around something and try and fix. But often the fixes you come up with are going to make things worse.
Which is why it's so important to humanize professional work. Which is because if we humanize it and we take off my professional hat and I'm my parent, you'll start to notice it's really just behavior. And it's really just recognizing that, no, you don't have to be responsible for fixing families. Your responsibility is to help them create values, help their own values, not your organization values, not your agency values, but helping families create their own sense of purpose is key. And help is really guiding, providing resources, partnering with people that you know as professionals who have those resources, and making sure you walk alongside parents so that they can get those resources that you have cultivated through your professional relationships. That's what professionals are supposed to do to support families. But I think the question becomes, what is support? What is engagement? And how do we not take it personal when the folks that are asking for it or don't know they need it dysregulate and act out and refuse it, or don't comply with whatever those things are that's supposed to comply? Then we don't take it personal. And now if I don't take it personal as a parent, it's not my stuff. This is the family, and how do I help them see it? And I think parenting has helped me understand engagement, because I was trying to come in and give them all the stuff, because I was like, this is what you need. If you have this, you will be successful. While they were telling me something completely different. They were saying, no, I don't need all of that. I need you to be present. I need you to hear me. I need you to allow me to hold space, to act out, and you still treat me as a human, and you don't take away all these things from me, but you allow me the opportunity, because I'm trying to heal. And I'm like, okay.
Take a deep breath.
Yeah.
Take a step back.
Yes.
Widen the lens a little bit.
That's it.
That aperture needs to open up, and we need to see things from other people's point of view.
Yes.
That is really, and I say this a lot, I mean, we can only really be subjective about ourselves. We need other people to help us to bring objectivity into the space, and we need other people to do that.
Yeah.
I think that's really important. Yeah. So, this idea of your 8 sons, I mean, you created something called the Fatherhood out of that.
Yeah. I created a comic book series called The Fatherhood. And the main characters of each one of these comic books that I'm hoping to continue to write are the main characters mixed. My sons are mixed in throughout this series. And this idea of normalizing the word father In all of our work, when we talk about families, is really key. I've been doing family work for so long that when I say fatherhood, it's now like, oh, okay, fathers are important. But even now, it's very difficult to talk about children and families, and father is a part of that conversation. And so I wanted to normalize this idea that no, fathers are present, fathers are involved, fathers are they have what is the intangibles where they love, they provide resources that go outside the realm of the money that they make and earn, and finding this way to really celebrate and encourage the stories of fathers. And particularly Black and brown fathers for me in my work is because I often see fathers in spaces that, you know, aren't always in the positive. So I'm always, I work with fathers that are incarcerated, formerly incarcerated, young fathers that are involved in our cross systems, child welfare, mental health, and juvenile justice spaces. And these are fathers that stories don't get told. And so for me, I was also a father. I was never incarcerated physically, but mentally, man, I was in prison to my ideologies, my own thoughts. And so I really wanted to reimagine what a father could look like when you see him as a superhero. And I know from working with children that that idea of your dad just being this superhero before you see him as, I don't know, Clark Kent, I don't know if I can use that, but this idea of human, seeing him as
Right.
human, you grow up and you first see him as this superhero. And I think that really helped me in my work serving kids in the JJ system, because when I talked about their dads, or when I asked them about their fathers, it was really, really negative. But when I said, could you imagine your father being a superhero? It was like the room lit up.
Well, was it even? I mean, I don't think it was a
Yeah.
leading question, right?
No.
You said how can you imagine
Yeah,
your father
father.
to be? And did they come up with the idea of a superhero?
Yeah, we all kind of came up with this
Got it.
concept of like, well, if you could imagine your father having powers, what would his superpowers be? And I was blown away to hear young men, I'm talking about 16, 17-year-old young men say, well, man, I wish my father would have had the superpower of like tucking me in at night during bedtime. This idea of like, I watched that on television and I knew from watching it on television, they thought, well, that's what fathers are supposed to do. But unfortunately, their father either wasn't there or didn't do it. And so these young men instantly knew that, oh, fathers are supposed to tuck their kids in bed. I wonder what that feels like to have that. So my dad would have the superpower of tucking me in at night. And I'm like, oh my gosh, yeah. Well, it was natural superpowers. It wasn't this ability to fly, but if it was about I would love for my dad to show up at my basketball game consistently, or show up at my sister's basketball game consistently. And so, or I wish my dad would hug me. I wish my dad had the superpower of affection. Like these were the things that they were coming up with as superhero powers. And I was like, well, dang, I also wish my father would have done that. And so I'm like, well, how many other boys would wish that their fathers would have the superpower of just showing up and hugging? And not for any other reason, not because I'm proud of you, simply because I love you, or having the superpower to say, I miss you. Like I just told my son that. Like my son is 28 years old, and I finally got to a point to normalize this idea that, oh, I felt something, I missed him. Why don't I just text him and call him and, hey, son, I miss you and I love you. And isn't that what you do when saying relationships?
That's what you do.
Right? And so I think for me, it's normalizing relationships, but also normalizing that fathers have the ability to do it too. But what might get in the way of their ability is how we socialize boys to become men. And that those kinds of attributes and feelings and emotions are not necessarily normalized in some communities, or just how we socialize men. And so, opening that up and tackling some of those came from what I had to experience raising 8 sons. They forced me to learn how to hug because I didn't know how to do that.
Well, one thing that tells me is that these superpowers,
Yeah.
they're within everyone's grasp.
Absolutely.
They're not something that you can't achieve.
Yeah.
They're right in front of you. You
Yeah.
just got to pick them up
Yeah.
and act accordingly.
And fathers have to know that, you know what, it's not the gifts that you bring outside of you. You are the gift. So your presence is enough. And I think that we have to reimagine that, or create spaces where fathers see that they have the superpower, their presence. If a dad just shows up and is present and people value him in some capacity, he may continue to show up. And that fatherhood, it's hard in some aspects. There's not a lot of confidence in, you get told that you're not a good father, you didn't do this right, you didn't do that right. You hear that enough times, you actually stop showing up. You don't feel confident. So,
Well, I mean, this is a perfect example of what we know now.
Yeah.
And what you've learned.
Yeah.
Throughout this life you've been living.
Yeah.
You've learned a lot, and it really fits into the theme of this podcast of discovery. And I think this is a really good spot to kind of stop and
I agree.
reflect on the fact that, hey, let's show up. Let's just show up and understand that we don't have to be anything more than what we are to make a difference.
That's it. That's it. Thank you for listening. Check out our programs on the Delta Project's website, thedeltaproject.co, and be sure to follow us on Spotify, YouTube, or wherever you get your podcasts.